Most people sleeping outside in Portland bought a tent first. Wren Calloway had tried that. She'd had 2 tents, a $40 Coleman from a Walmart parking lot handoff, and a slightly sturdier one someone left by the river. And she already knew something about tents that most people figure out only after they're already cold and wet inside one. A tent keeps rain off. It does almost nothing for cold. The fabric between you and 28-degree air is 3 millimeters of nylon, and nylon doesn't trap heat. It conducts cold straight through to you the moment your body stops moving. Both of her tents were wet within 72 hours of a Portland rain. The second, one had a broken pole she didn't know about until she was already inside it at midnight, and it collapsed on her face. She was done with tents. What she found instead, and what she spent $15 on at a farm supply store on the eastern edge of the city, was a single roll of agricultural silage wrap, the kind dairy farmers use to seal bales of fermented hay. Lime green. Heavy, made from low-density polyethylene with a UV inhibitor pressed into it. The roll she bought was 20 inches wide and roughly 500 feet long. 12 pounds of it wound tight on a cardboard core. She carried it back to her spot on her shoulder, one-handed like it was a piece of lumber she just had cut to length. That was November. By the time January arrived, her structure under that overpass was warmer than either tent had ever been. Not warmer in some loose, hard-to-pin-down way. Warmer in the way where you take your gloves off at night, because they're actually unnecessary. Warmer in the way where you wake up and your breath isn't visible inside the space. Warmer by about 17 degrees Fahrenheit on a still night, measured with a dollar store thermometer she kept hung from the ridgeline. Her 2 tents, on their best nights, had held a 4-degree difference. On windy nights, less. Here's how she built it. The spot Wren was using was in the second bay of an overpass on the east side of the city. Not the best location. The most sheltered position had been claimed by someone who'd been there longer. Her bay was about 14 feet wide where the concrete wall met the ground, open on 2 sides with a drip line running off the road deck above, when it rained and a south wind that moved through the opening with no resistance most nights. She spent 14 nights there before she found the silage wrap, and she'd been cold all 14 of them. The problem with an open underpass bay isn't that it's wet. The deck above handles most of that. The problem is airflow. The wind moves through exposed spaces the way water moves through a pipe, constantly, and in one direction. Every time it moves, it pulls the thin envelope of warm air your body builds around itself and replaces it with cold air from outside. For she could feel this in her sleeping bag. Getting in warm, staying warm for maybe 45 minutes, and then spending the rest of the night fighting a slow, relentless cooling that the bag couldn't keep up with. For she'd talked to a man named Dennis who'd been living under the Morrison Bridge, about a mile and a half west, for 3 winters at that point. He was 51. He'd worked construction for 14 years before his situation changed, and he brought that way of thinking, what holds, what doesn't, what the failure mode is, to every problem he worked on outside. Dennis had figured something out on his second winter that he said had barely traveled beyond the small cluster of people he knew personally. Silage wrap, he told her, isn't just a moisture barrier. When you trap air inside it in layers and keep those layers separated, it behaves almost identically to the air pocket insulation in a quality sleeping bag. The physics is the same. Trapped still air doesn't move. Air that doesn't move can't carry heat away from your body, and low-density polyethylene is extremely good at holding a boundary between 2 air masses without letting them mix. Dennis had lined the inside of a plywood sleeping box with 3 separated layers of silage wrap, and so the difference between 1 layer and 3, with actual gaps between them, was around 12 degrees of retained warmth. He'd tested it with a meat thermometer. He'd been sleeping warmer than most of the people around him for 2 winters by the time Wren showed up near his usual circuit. Wren didn't have plywood. She had the wrap, 2 bungee cords, a length of paracord she always kept with her, a handful of zip ties, and a serrated bread knife she used for everything from cutting fruit to scoring tape. Or she was going to have to figure out the geometry herself. Is this the part where the whole thing becomes obvious? Not yet. The first thing Wren had to solve wasn't the plastic. It was structure. Plastic film can't insulate if it doesn't have shape. Without something holding it off your body and off itself, the wind collapses it flat against you and you're left with a cold sheet instead of an air pocket. Or she'd watched people make this mistake with plastic sheeting and tarps. They wrapped themselves up tight, direct contact, and then were confused about why they were still cold. The plastic in those cases was doing almost nothing. It was blocking a little wind, and adding a tiny bit of radiant reflection, but no trapped air, which meant no insulation. The insulation was the air. The plastic was just the wall that held the air in place. She spent the first afternoon not touching the silage wrap at all. She walked the bay and thought about anchor points. There were 4 concrete support columns in the overpass structure, spaced roughly 7 feet apart. She chose 2 of them, the ones that gave her the most interior space while still being protected on the sides, as her primary anchors. She ran her paracord between them at 5 feet off the ground, pulled it as tight as she could manage, and tied it off on each side so it didn't sag more than an inch or two in the middle. That was her ridgeline. Then she found 2 pieces of rebar that had been left near a concrete pour further back under the bridge, each about 3 feet long, and zip-tied them vertically against the base of each column, 1 foot off the ground. Those were her bottom anchors, as she now had a top anchor line and 2 low side anchors, and she hadn't used a single inch of silage wrap yet. She cut her first section of wrap about 8 feet long. She folded it twice lengthwise until it was 4 layers thick and maybe 5 inches wide, then draped it over the ridge line so it fell evenly on both sides. The front edge she left loose. The back edge, touching the concrete wall, she pressed flat and anchored with a strip of wrap wound around the rebar at the base. That was her first wall panel. A layer facing inward, a layer at the wall, and a gap between them held open by the ridge at the top. Then she cut a second piece, 12 feet this time, and looped it horizontally around the outside of the bay at about 2 feet off the ground. She tied both ends to the rebar stakes and pulled it slightly away from the concrete wall using 2 sticks she'd broken from a piece of shipping pallet. 3-inch gap, all the way across. Still air in that gap. Nowhere for it to go. She did the same at 4 feet high. Same horizontal band, same gap, same still air column between the plastic and the wall. What she had now, at the back and sides of the bay, was a double wall panel. 2 parallel sheets of plastic separated by 3 inches of air that the wind couldn't reach. The wall the wind actually hit was the outermost sheet. The second sheet was calm. The air between them was calm. And her body, on the inside of that second sheet, was benefiting from both gaps. Dennis, when she walked him through it the following week, said it was the same principle as a thermos. 2 walls with air between them. Nothing moves between the walls. What's inside stays inside. He said he'd been trying to explain the basic idea to people for 2 winters, and most of them couldn't get past the part where the plastic looked cheap and temporary, so they assumed it worked the way cheap and temporary things worked. The outdoor gear stores had no particular interest in correcting that impression. Their business was tents and sleeping bags and foam pads. None of those cost $15. The roof was where Wren had expected to spend most of her time problem-solving. It ended up being the fastest part. The ridgeline was already there. She cut a long piece of silage wrap, about 14 feet, and pulled it up over the cord so it formed a low peaked shape, the cord running along the peak, the wrap falling evenly to each side. She didn't fasten the side edges fully down. She left the front, the door side, open about 2 feet, and let the side edges rest on top of the horizontal bands she'd already built. The peaked shape was the critical decision. A flat roof collects standing water, and enough standing water will sag the plastic and eventually dump into your living space, sometimes in the middle of the night. A peaked roof runs water off to the sides before it can accumulate. Wren had a slight natural slope to work with. The overpass deck above wasn't perfectly level, and she oriented the peak so the low side faced toward the drip line that ran off the edge of the deck. Her water, hitting the roof, would slide toward the outer edge and fall away from her floor space. She put a second layer on the roof, same principle as the walls, draped it so it didn't touch the first layer except at the peak, ran a strip of folded wrap along the ridgeline as a spacer, 1/2 inch of separation at the top, widening as the layers fell away from each other. A column of still air between them, from peak to edge. The roof was finished in about 40 minutes. From the outside in the dark, it looked like a sagging lime green tent shape. From the inside, it was 6 feet long, 4.5 feet wide at the base, and just over 4 feet at the peak. Enough to sit up straight, enough to stretch out fully. On the first night, with the temperature outside at 31 degrees, the interior held at 48. That's 17 degrees of difference, with no heat source, other than her body. She'd slept in a $40 tent at 31 degrees and woken up with her sleeping bag damp and her hands numb. Not this night. The floor was the problem she'd been getting wrong for the entire month before the shelter. And getting the floor wrong in cold weather is a faster way to a bad night than almost anything else. Worse than a leaky roof, worse than a drafty wall, because the floor is where you lose heat you can't see leaving. She'd used cardboard, because cardboard was what everyone told her to use. She'd watched other people do it. She'd pulled cardboard from behind restaurants, broken down the boxes flat, built up a pad 4 inches thick. And cardboard does insulate. It genuinely does, especially when it's dry. But cardboard absorbs moisture from both directions, from below and from body condensation above. And once it absorbs moisture, it compresses. Compressed wet cardboard is barely better than sleeping on the concrete it's sitting on. Concrete pulls heat out of your body through direct conduction. It doesn't matter what the air temperature is doing. A 55-degree slab will drain warmth from your back and hips all night without pause, because concrete and your body are in direct contact and heat always moves toward the colder material. A sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees fails on bare concrete not because it's rated wrong, but because sleeping bag ratings assume you're not losing heat through the bottom faster than the bag can retain it on the top and sides. Wren fixed this with a version of the same air pocket reasoning she'd used on the walls, where she cut a piece of wrap about 8 feet by 5 feet. She folded it back and forth on itself in tight accordion pleats, each fold about 1.5 inches wide until the whole sheet was compressed into a panel roughly 6 inches thick. Then she cut a narrow strip of wrap and wound it loosely around the outside of the folded panel to hold the pleats in place without compressing them. The result was a pad full of trapped air pockets, running the entire length and width of it. None of them connected to each other, all of them held in place by the folds. When she pressed on it, it pushed back. That resistance was the air in the pockets. She slept on it the first night and woke up with her hips and lower back not hurting. That was new. She'd been waking up with lower back pain every single morning for the first month of sleeping outside. She hadn't connected it to the floor until she stopped having it. The pad cost nothing. It was built entirely from the scraps left over after she'd cut the wall and roof sections. The door stayed a problem longer than any other part of the build. Weeks, not days. She'd left a 2-foot opening at the front for 2 reasons: ventilation and exit speed. She'd read, somewhere she couldn't quite remember, that sealed shelters with any kind of combustion heat source inside could become dangerous. She had no heat source, but the habit of thinking about ventilation stayed with her, and she wanted to be able to get out fast if she needed to. A tied or zipped closure was a hazard she didn't want. Anything that required more than 1 second to get through in the wrong situation was a problem. But an open door isn't a door, it's a hole. The warm air she was building up inside the shelter was escaping through it all night, and the cold air was coming in from the bottom where the airflow was lowest. She could feel the temperature gradient just by reaching her hand from head height down toward the floor. It dropped at least 5 degrees between the peak and the ground near the door. The answer she landed on, after watching some agricultural plastic handling techniques from farming videos she'd seen before losing regular internet access, was overlapping flaps rather than any kind of closure or tie. She cut 2 strips of silage wrap about 3 feet wide each and secured them at the very top of the door opening, one from the left column and one from the right. Each fell down from the top and overlapped in the center by 8 inches. You pushed through them to get in, like walking through overlapping curtains. And when you let go of them, they fell back by their own weight, and the 8-inch overlap sealed the center gap again. One layer of that wasn't enough. She added a second pair of flaps behind the first, but overlapping in the opposite direction, so the left panel of the second layer went on top of the right panel instead of under it. Wind from the south pushed the outer flaps one way, the inner flaps resisted from the other direction. Between the 2 layers, the airflow through the door dropped to almost nothing. She added a 3rd layer, also reversed, 2 weeks later. After the 3rd layer went up, she sat inside on a windy night and held a lit match near the door. The flame barely moved. The woman from the outreach organization who walked up to the shelter in December didn't know what she was looking at. She saw green plastic and asked Wren if she needed a warmer sleeping bag. Wren held the woman's hand just inside the door opening for about 15 seconds without saying anything. The woman went quiet. She said she'd expected it to feel like outside. It felt like a closet. Still, slightly warm, the air not moving at all. That stillness is what the build was for, not the plastic. The stillness, maintenance was something Wren hadn't thought much about before the build, and ended up thinking about constantly after it. Her silage wrap is made to survive a full agricultural season, 5 to 7 months of field exposure, including UV, rain, temperature variation, and physical pressure from whatever it's wrapped around. Under an overpass, With the deck above cutting most of the direct UV exposure, the film degraded slower than it would have in open air. The walls and roof were mostly in shadow during peak sun hours. She didn't see any cracking or brittleness in the roof or wall panels until around 9 months in, which is when she was already in transitional housing and the shelter had passed to Terrence. What did degrade sooner were the moving parts. The door flaps, after about 3 months of daily pushing through, developed small tears at the top anchor points where the weight of the flap was concentrating all its stress on the same inch of plastic every time it moved. She replaced those flaps twice before she left in April. Each replacement took about 20 minutes. The lower horizontal band at knee height, the one most exposed to foot traffic, tore along one seam in February when someone stepped on it walking past. She doubled it with a second strip of wrap, layered right over the damaged one, and anchored both ends again. It held for the rest of the winter. The accordion ground pad lasted best of everything. She replaced the outer wrapping strip in March when cold cycling cracked it along a fold. The pad itself, the accordion pleats inside, was undamaged. She rewrapped it in 10 minutes. Total additional cost, $0. She still had roughly 1,100 feet of wrap on the roll. The shelter didn't solve everything. That's worth being clear about, because the temptation when something works well is to say it works fully. It doesn't solve flooding. The accordion ground pad is the first thing that fails when water runs across the surface it's sitting on. Low-density polyethylene doesn't absorb water. That's one of its properties. But if water runs under the pad and soaks the ground beneath it, the cold from the wet ground conducts up through the pad and negates the air pockets. It's not that the pad fails as a material. It's that the pad loses its thermal gap when the cold source below gets close enough to close it. Wren found this out in a hard December rain before she'd fully mapped the drainage pattern of her bay. Water ran in from the south end in a thin sheet across the concrete floor, and the ground pad wicked cold up through the bottom in about 2 hours. She moved the pad 18 inches toward the wall the next morning, where the concrete slope directed water away from rather than toward the shelter. It didn't happen again. The shelter also doesn't protect against people. It's visually obvious. Lime green plastic under a bridge is not invisible, and the overlapping door flaps don't stop someone who knows they can just push through them. Wren had this happen twice. Both times it was someone who meant no harm and didn't realize they were walking into someone's space. But the risk is real, and it doesn't have a material solution. Location is the only solution, and location is only partially under your control. What the shelter does solve, specifically wind, which it stops almost entirely, radiant heat loss to cold surfaces above and to the side, which the wall layers address, conductive heat loss from the ground, which the accordion pad addresses, rain and precipitation falling on the structure itself, which the peaked roof handles. 4 problems. All 4 handled. It's not nothing. Dennis knew the insulation principle for 2 winters before Wren met him. He'd told maybe 6 people. Not because he was holding it back. He would have told anyone who asked. But because the people who needed it most weren't often close enough to the people who knew it long enough for the conversation to happen. The knowledge was real, tested, and repeatable. It just didn't have anywhere to go. Wren met Dennis because she'd camped within 4 blocks of his regular route for 11 days. A woman from a service organization who visited the area twice a week had connected them after she noticed Wren's setup and mentioned she knew someone who'd worked out some shelter solutions. Dennis and Wren talked for about 20 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. He drew a rough diagram of his 3-layer wall on the back of a fast food bag. She built her version of it over the next 4 days. He'd spent 2 cold winters developing that 20-minute conversation. She got it free. That's the part of this that's hard to look at directly. The gap isn't between what's possible and what's difficult. The shelter works. It's buildable in under a day, with $15 of material, and the core principle is simple enough to explain on the back of a bag. The gap is between the people who have worked it out and the people who are in their first or second winter and don't know yet that there's anything to work out. The camping gear stores carry what the camping gear stores carry. The farm supply stores don't advertise silage wrap to people sleeping outside. Nobody is suppressing anything. It just never crossed between those 2 worlds before Dennis started talking. Wren talked to 4 people after she built her shelter, showed 2 of them how to build the accordion pad. One of them, a woman named Kara, who was 19 and had been outside for 3 weeks, built a full version of the shelter in the same overpass district. 6 days later, Wren gave her 200 feet of wrap from the roll. The roll still had over 900 feet on it at that point. A few practical things for anyone who needs them. Farm supply stores are the place to start. Tractor Supply, Rural King, any store with an agricultural section. Sure. The wrap is usually stocked in a couple of widths. 20 inches and wider rolls both work, and the wider rolls give you more surface area to work with for the ground pad. Price runs $12 to $19 depending on roll size. If there's a choice, get the longer roll. You'll use more than you think on the accordion pad alone. For anchor points, 2 fixed vertical surfaces, 5 to 8 feet apart, are the foundation of the whole build. Concrete columns, fence posts, anything that doesn't move. For the ridge line, you need something to run a cord between at around 4 to 5 feet of height. If there's nothing to anchor a ridge line to, a freestanding A-frame ridge is possible using 2 forked sticks driven into soft ground. It's less stable but workable on a calm night. For the air gap in the walls, rigid spacers at least 2 inches thick. Sticks work. Folded cardboard wedged in place works. Scraps of rebar. The gap needs to stay open. If it collapses to less than 1 inch, the still air column gets too thin to hold meaningful insulation value. 3 inches is the target. More than 4 inches, and the air inside the gap starts to circulate, which reduces its effectiveness as an insulator. Here's for the accordion ground pad. The fold width matters more than anything else. Each pleat about 1.5 inches wide, or tighter than that, and you're not getting enough air volume per pocket. Looser than that, and the pockets get large enough to allow some internal circulation. When the finished pad is right, pressing on it feels slightly springy. That's the air in the pockets resisting. If it feels flat and dense, the folds are too tight. If it feels squishy and unstable, the folds are too loose. For the door, overlap each panel by at least 6 inches. Alternate the overlap direction between layers. The alternating is what makes it self-closing against wind from any angle. If all the panels overlap the same direction, wind from one side will push them all open at once. For placement, read the drainage of your spot before you commit to a floor position. Watch where water moves in rain before you put the accordion pad down. 20 minutes of watching water in a light rain will tell you everything you need to know about where the floor should and shouldn't be. What doesn't work, because this is the part most people get wrong the first time they try it. Wrapping yourself directly in the plastic. 1 layer of plastic against your sleeping bag or your body does almost nothing for heat. It blocks some wind and it reflects a small amount of radiant heat back, but it creates no air pockets, so it provides no insulation. The plastic is not what insulates. The air is. Single-layer plastic with no gap is like having a window with no panes. It blocks wind but lets cold pass right through. The air gap is everything. Without it, you're not doing the same thing Wren did. You're doing something different that doesn't work. Also, don't build in a high-foot traffic path if you can avoid it. The overlapping door flaps work well against wind. They don't work against someone walking through them who doesn't know they're there. You will get visitors you didn't invite, and the flaps won't stop them. And test the roof drainage in rain before you sleep under it for the first time. Pull back the door flaps and watch where water runs when it hits the roof. If it runs toward the door opening instead of away from it, reposition the ridgeline so the peak tilts the other direction. Getting this wrong means waking up to water dripping onto your sleeping bag, and wet insulation, whether in a sleeping bag or in a silage wrap accordion pad, insulates at roughly 10% of its dry capacity. Wren left in April for a transitional housing placement 3 miles north. She'd been on the wait list for 7 months. She left the shelter standing. She wasn't going to take it apart. Terrence, who'd been in the bay across from hers for 6 weeks, moved into it within 48 hours of her leaving. He added a second bungee anchor on the south side, where the wind sometimes pushed the lower wall band off. One of the sticks, he reinforced the roof peak with a strip of duct tape along the ridgeline where the 2 layers had started to wear against each other. He lived in it through the summer. The total Wren spent, across the full winter from November to April, $15 for the silage wrap, $2.47 for a pack of zip ties. The paracord and bungee cords she already had. The rebar was found. The sticks were found. The bread knife she'd had for months before she was ever outside. $17.47 for a structure that held 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air through 31 nights below freezing. That she could build in under 4 hours. That another person moved into and lived in for another 5 months after she left. For comparison, a 4-season backpacking tent starts at $180 and held maybe 4 degrees warmer than outside air on a still night. A 20-degree sleeping system starts at $140 and provides no floor insulation. They're wet, both fail fast, and neither is easy to dry in a Portland winter. The next part of Wren's story covers something she didn't expect to have to solve: condensation. When the temperature swings between cold nights and warmer afternoons, the inside walls of a silage-wrapped shelter collect moisture, not from rain. From the temperature difference alone, by February she had a specific system for managing it. Not what most people assume, not ventilation holes, and not a heat source. Something she worked out over about 3 weeks of getting it wrong first. That's the next one.